That ugly flood wall is ruining our view. You're turning this place into a junkyard.
Constance Fairweather jabbed her manicured finger at my concrete barrier, while her fellow mansion owners nodded agreement. The sharp tap of her diamond ring against her clipboard echoed like a judge's gavel. The entire HOA made mocking my ugly flood wall their obsession. $500 daily fines, emergency meetings ridiculing my prison fortress, social posts calling it an eyesore, destroying our mansion values. Then she crossed the line. At my wife's funeral, this pharmaceutical heiress whispered, "He's unstable. Building walls because he couldn't save Miriam." That's when I stopped playing their game. As a retired Army Corps engineer, I knew these million-dollar mansion owners built their dreams on former wetlands. Hurricane Delilah was spinning toward us with unprecedented, catastrophic flooding warnings. Something told me my ugly wall was about to become very important. Ever been mocked for preparing? Share your HOA nightmare below. My name's Ezra Blackwood, and 3 years ago, I thought moving to Willowbrook Estates would be my fresh start. I should have known better when the realtor kept dodging questions about flood insurance. I'm a 52-year-old retired civil engineer who spent 3 decades building levees for the Army Corps. When my wife Miriam lost her battle with cancer, I couldn't handle our old house anymore. Every creaking floorboard sounded like her footsteps. Every room smelled like the lavender lotion she used during chemo. So I sold everything, took my modest pension, and bought the cheapest house in Florida's most prestigious gated community. My 1960s ranch cost $340,000. The pharmaceutical heiress across the street, her marble palace cost $2.8 million. Willowbrook Estates sprawls across 400 acres of former wetlands, 15 miles from the coast. 200 families live here in architectural magazine perfection. Circular driveways paved with imported stone, fountains that cost more than teacher salaries, Tesla charging stations in every 3-car garage. My house sits on lot 47, the lowest elevation in the entire development. The builder called it water views. What they didn't mention was the original wetland survey, showing this exact spot as the natural collection point for storm drainage from 50 square miles of urban development. Always check FEMA flood maps before buying property. The database is free online and shows exactly where water flows during major storms. After Hurricane Beatrice clipped us last spring, I watched muddy water cascade through million-dollar landscaping like chocolate rivers. The acrid smell of flood-soaked drywall filled the air for weeks. My neighbors treated it like a spa inconvenience. Insurance adjusters swarmed, writing 6-figure checks to restore perfection. Mrs. Victor wasn't so lucky. The 78-year-old Taiwanese widow stood in her flooded basement, tears mixing with the brown water around her ankles. "In Taiwan, we learned to read the land," she told me quietly. "Water always remembers where it belongs." Her late husband Harold had been the city's chief engineer, who'd opposed this development 20 years ago. "He said building here was like putting houses in a soup bowl," she whispered, watching mold creep up her walls. But they offered him early retirement to keep quiet. I applied for a permit to build a 3-foot concrete flood wall. Professional engineering specifications, proper drainage calculations, everything designed to redirect water towards storm drains instead of into foundations. That permit application triggered an emergency HOA meeting. Constance Fairweather arrived in her white Tesla like a conquering general. Designer heels clicking across marble floors with military precision. The pharmaceutical heiress carried herself with the confidence that comes from inheriting $40 million and marrying a city councilman. "Mr. Blackwood," she announced, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, "your proposed barrier violates our aesthetic covenants. This isn't some trailer park where people build whatever they want." The metallic scratch of her Mont Blanc pen on legal documents sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard as she highlighted violations in the architectural guidelines. "It's engineered flood protection," I said calmly. 3 feet high, properly drained, designed to save foundations. "Our drainage system was professionally designed," she snapped, her diamond tennis bracelet catching fluorescent light like shattered ice. "If you're worried about water, buy flood insurance like everyone else." Mini twist. What Constance didn't know was that I'd already pulled the original drainage permits. 3 required retention ponds were never built. The developer pocketed the money and hoped nobody would check. The vote was 6-1 against my wall. Only Mrs. Victor raised her weathered hand in support, earning a withering glare from Constance that could have frozen antifreeze. But Constance wasn't done. As the meeting ended, she cornered me by the marble fountain in the lobby, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Mr. Blackwood, if you build that eyesore anyway, I'll fine you $500 every single day until you tear it down. And trust me, I have deeper pockets than your little pension can handle." The sweet smell of honeysuckle from the landscaping couldn't mask the stench of corruption wafting from her threat. 2 weeks later, I started mixing concrete. Some fights are worth having. Constance didn't waste time making good on her threat. 3 days after I poured the first concrete footer, a cream-colored envelope appeared in my mailbox with gold embossing that screamed, "Expensive lawyers." The cease and desist letter came from Whitman, Sterling and Associates, the kind of law firm that charges $800 an hour to intimidate retirees. They demanded immediate demolition of my unauthorized structure and threatened a lien on my property for accumulated violations. I'd learned something during my Army Corps years. When bureaucrats start throwing around legal threats, it usually means they're standing on shaky ground. What they don't tell you is that HOA boards can only fine you for violations explicitly listed in your community's covenants. They can't create new rules just to target someone they don't like. But Constance was creative, I'll give her that. She organized an emergency aesthetic committee that descended on my property every Tuesday morning like a flock of designer-clad buzzards. 6 HOA board members would circle my wall, taking photographs from every angle, measuring shadows it cast on the manicured sidewalk. The sharp click of heels on concrete became my weekly alarm clock, followed by the metallic scratch of gold-plated pens documenting every perceived violation. They complained about the wall's height, its color, its industrial appearance, and its negative psychological impact on neighborhood harmony. The smell of their collective perfume mixed with fresh concrete created an oddly nauseating combination that lingered in my driveway long after they left. Constance leaked the story to the Herald Tribune, which ran it with the headline, "Homeowner's Fortress Threatens Property Values in Exclusive Community." The article painted me as an antisocial recluse, building defensive structures because I couldn't cope with grief. "This is supposed to be a neighborhood where families feel safe," Constance told the reporter, standing beside her $50,000 Italian marble fountain. "Mr. Blackwood's wall sends the wrong message about our community values." What she didn't know, what none of them bothered to investigate, was that my wall was actually protecting their precious drainage system. During the first heavy thunderstorm after construction, I set up my old surveying equipment to document water flow patterns. The results were poetry in hydraulic engineering. Rainwater hit my concrete barrier and flowed smoothly toward storm drains, instead of pooling around foundations like it had for years. Mrs. Victor noticed immediately. "My basement's dry," she called out excitedly the morning after the storm, her weathered face beaming as she showed me her concrete floor, completely moisture-free for the first time in 3 years. "Harold always said water follows the path of least resistance," she explained, running her fingers along my wall's drainage channels. "You've just given it the right path." But my engineering success meant nothing to Constance's escalation campaign. Anonymous posts appeared on the neighborhood Facebook group questioning my mental health. "Building walls because he couldn't save his wife," one comment suggested. Another wondered whether someone, clearly struggling with grief, should be making major structural modifications that affect everyone. The psychological warfare was subtle, but devastating. Neighbors who'd never spoken to me started offering pitying smiles during morning walks. The mailman began leaving packages at the gate instead of walking to my door. Even teenagers started using my wall as a backdrop for TikTok videos about crazy neighbors. Constance found an elegant solution to legal limitations on HOA authority. She hired independent contractors to evaluate my property for city building code compliance. Suddenly, inspectors appeared weekly, armed with measuring tapes and clipboards thick as phone books. Each inspection generated new violation notices. Unpermitted concrete work, $200. Drainage modification without approval, $350. Aesthetic violation of municipal standards, $500. The fines were bleeding my retirement savings like a slow hemorrhage. In 6 weeks, I'd accumulated $8,400 in penalties, More money than Miriam and I used to spend in 6 months. But Constance made one crucial mistake. She underestimated a career engineer's appetite for documentation. I started haunting the county records office, pulling every file related to Willowbrook's development. The musty smell of archived papers and the satisfying weight of 20-year-old survey maps became my daily therapy session. What I discovered in those yellow documents made my pulse quicken. The original environmental impact study had been revised after submission to state regulators. 3 retention ponds required for flood control, designed to handle exactly the kind of water flow my wall was now managing, had been deleted from final construction plans. The developer had pocketed $400,000 in environmental bonds meant to fund those ponds. Even better, the original wetlands survey showed natural drainage patterns identical to what I'd documented with my time-lapse photography. My wall wasn't creating new water flow. It was restoring the natural drainage that existed before bulldozers turned wetlands into mansion lots. I photocopied every document, digitized every survey map, and started building a legal arsenal that would make Constance's pharmaceutical fortune look like tip money. The weekly fines kept arriving with clockwork precision, but now they felt different. Each cream-colored envelope was just more evidence of systematic harassment. Constance's next escalation came disguised as civic duty. A city code enforcement officer appeared at my door on a Tuesday morning, clutching a clipboard like it contained nuclear launch codes. Mr. Blackwood, anonymous complaint about unpermitted construction and safety hazards. Officer Martinez looked embarrassed, like a cop forced to arrest someone for jaywalking. I need to inspect your wall. The inspection took 3 hours and covered everything from concrete density to drainage pipe angles. Martinez seemed competent, but his questions came straight from graduate-level engineering textbooks, way beyond routine code enforcement. Who filed the complaint? Can't say. Came through the city council office. Constance's husband's office, naturally. The pharmaceutical princess was cashing in political favors like poker chips. What followed was bureaucratic waterboarding. Weekly inspectors with specialized clipboards descended like locusts, structural engineers, environmental specialists, even a neighborhood aesthetics consultant who measured my wall's beige paint against municipal color palettes with the seriousness of a museum curator. Each visit generated new violations. Unpermitted concrete work, $200. Aesthetic non-compliance, $350. Drainage modification without municipal approval, $500. My retirement account was bleeding faster than a hedge fund during a market crash. But Constance's cruelest weapon wasn't financial. It was social exile. My grocery delivery driver suddenly developed navigation problems. GPS can't find your address, sir. Company policy says we can't deliver to disputed properties. The lawn care service that maintained the entire neighborhood mysteriously became unavailable for my lot. Even Tommy, the teenager who'd washed my truck for gas money, stopped showing up. Mom says I can't work for you anymore, he mumbled when I cornered him at the mailboxes. Something about insurance liability with your legal problems. Constance was creating a quarantine zone around my property, one whispered conversation at a time. The isolation was worse than the fines. During Miriam's final months, at least I'd had her hand to hold while fighting the insurance company's claim denials. Now, I was battling alone against an enemy with unlimited resources and political connections. Mrs. Victor brought me dumplings that smelled like home-cooked defiance, but even she was feeling the pressure. Mrs. Fairweather suggested I reconsider my friendship with problematic neighbors, she whispered, her weathered hands trembling as she served soup. Said it might affect my property values. The woman was 78 years old on a fixed income, and Constance was threatening her financial security to get to me. That's when something clicked, a memory from my Army Corps days dealing with congressional oversight committees. When bureaucrats start bending rules for political pressure, they create paper trails that can destroy careers. Every inspector visiting my property filed mandatory public reports. I started requesting copies through Freedom of Information Act requests, building my own surveillance network of Constance's harassment campaign. The results were beautiful contradictions. Inspector notes consistently praised my engineering. Structure exceeds safety standards. Professional grade construction. Drainage system functions perfectly. Yet somehow, Every inspection generated new violation notices for increasingly creative infractions. Even better, I discovered several inspectors were being paid overtime specifically to examine my property, unusual for routine code enforcement. Someone was spending serious taxpayer money to harass one retiree, and I had the receipts. But my real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Diana Reeves, an investigative reporter from the Herald Tribune, approached me at the records office, where I'd become a familiar fixture among dusty filing cabinets. "Your HOA story keeps intersecting with our corruption investigation," she said over coffee that tasted like burnt hope. Willowbrook appears in financial records we're tracking across 3 counties. She'd been following money trails through development contracts, municipal permits, and political donations. My harassment case was apparently just one tentacle of a much larger octopus. "Would you share your documentation?" she asked. "Your inspection reports could be the smoking gun we need." I handed over everything: violation notices, inspector reports, HOA financial records, even my time-lapse drainage footage. For the first time in months, I felt like David had found someone willing to help aim the slingshot. But Constance wasn't finished. The next week brought her nuclear option, a formal complaint to Adult Protective Services claiming I was showing signs of concerning behavioral changes since my wife's death. 2 social workers appeared at my door with clipboards and concerned expressions, asking questions about my mental state and whether I was coping appropriately with grief and loss. "Building walls can sometimes indicate social isolation and paranoid ideation," one explained gently, as if my engineering degree had evaporated along with my mental competence. I showed them my professional credentials, my detailed drainage calculations, and my correspondence with city engineers. They left looking confused but satisfied that I wasn't a danger to myself or others. Still, the message was clear. Constance was willing to weaponize grief counseling to destroy me. She'd just made her biggest mistake, attacking my competence as an engineer. That was personal. The Adult Protective Services complaint backfired spectacularly. Both social workers left shaking their heads, like they'd been forced to investigate whether gravity was a mental health issue. "This doesn't seem like wellness concern, Mr. Blackwood," the senior caseworker told me quietly. "Someone's weaponizing our services for personal vendettas." She handed me her card with a look that could melt steel. "Call me if you need documentation that this complaint was bogus. We don't appreciate being used as attack dogs." Constance had just armed me with government witnesses willing to testify about systematic harassment, but pharmaceutical heiresses don't surrender easily. Her next escalation was beautifully subtle: systematic destruction of my daily support network. My regular coffee shop suddenly couldn't make my usual order due to supply issues. Apparently medium roast was now an exotic commodity. The pharmacy where I'd filled Miriam's prescriptions claimed my insurance was showing verification problems and suggested I try somewhere else. Even my bank started calling about suspicious financial activity. Turns out paying legal fees and municipal fines triggers fraud algorithms faster than buying lottery tickets in Vegas. The institutional paranoia was suffocating, like being slowly strangled by red tape and corporate policies. But Constance's masterpiece was organizing a community safety forum at the clubhouse, complete with catered wine and a guest psychologist speaking on identifying problematic neighbor behaviors. Mrs. Victor attended as my unofficial spy and returned with intelligence that made my blood pressure spike. She had slides, Ezra, actual PowerPoint presentations about your wall. Mrs. Victor's hands trembled as she served tea that tasted like outrage mixed with Earl Grey. Photos from every angle, arrows pointing at concerning design elements, psychological profiles of isolated homeowners creating defensive barriers after trauma. The presentation included my wall as Exhibit A in a case study about grief-related construction projects that threaten community well-being. 43 neighbors attended. Only Mrs. Victor and 2 others walked out in disgust. "She's turning Miriam's death into amateur psychology," Mrs. Victor whispered, tears mixing with fury. "Making your love sound like mental illness." That's when Constance made her fatal error. She was so obsessed with destroying me personally that she forgot about Diana Reeves quietly building a financial crimes case. While Constance played armchair psychiatrist, Diana was following money trails through public records that told a very different story about Willowbrook's Queen Bee. "Your HOA president has expensive habits," Diana called to tell me on Thursday morning, her voice electric with discovery. "We've traced $847,000 in irregular transfers through shell companies owned by her relatives." The rabbit hole was magnificent. Management contracts to her brother's firm at triple market rates, landscaping deals to her tennis partner's company without competitive bidding, even community center repairs handled by contractors who happened to donate heavily to her husband's campaigns. But the crown jewel was environmental bond money, meant for those missing retention ponds. The $400,000 had been quietly transferred to a beautification fund that paid for decorative median strips directly in front of Constance's mansion. "She's been treating the HOA like her personal ATM," Diana explained. "Your harassment was just convenient distraction from embezzlement." Meanwhile, I'd gained an unexpected ally, Marcus Webb, an insurance adjuster who'd been documenting suspicious claim patterns across 3 counties. His findings were devastating for Constance's narrative. 26 flood damage claims from Willowbrook residents have been denied due to pre-existing drainage issues, Marcus told me over coffee, that smelled like justice brewing. Issues that didn't exist until homes started sinking into those missing retention areas. He'd calculated that proper drainage, exactly what my wall provided, could have prevented $2.1 million in legitimate insurance payouts that residents never received. But Constance wasn't finished with personal attacks. She filed a formal lawsuit, claiming my wall created hydraulic damming effects that artificially redirected floodwater toward neighboring properties, despite zero evidence of anyone experiencing increased water problems since construction. The suit demanded $100,000 in damages, plus immediate demolition, supported by expert engineering testimony from the same firm that had designed Willowbrook's original drainage disaster. If that wasn't conflict of interest, I didn't know what was. Her nuclear option was scheduling an emergency HOA vote to condemn my property as a community safety hazard, with mandatory attendance for all homeowners. But this time, I was ready. Mrs. Victor rallied her network of supporters while I prepared counterattack documentation. Diana would attend with cameras rolling. Marcus had agreed to provide expert testimony about flood prevention engineering. For 6 months, Constance had controlled the narrative through whisper campaigns and bureaucratic intimidation. Now she was about to face facts, journalism, and expert witnesses in front of 200 neighbors. The metallic taste of anticipation was replacing months of bitter frustration as her harassment campaign prepared to implode under public scrutiny. Thursday evening was going to be spectacular. The smoking gun arrived on a rain-soaked Wednesday morning, delivered in a manila folder that Diana Reeves placed on my kitchen table with the reverence of someone handling evidence in a murder trial. "State Archives," she said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. 28 years, buried in bureaucratic storage. The document smelled like decades of government neglect, mixed with the musty truth that powerful people had tried to bury. What I read made my coffee taste like bitter vindication. Original Willowbrook development contracts from 1998 told a story that would have made Harold Victor weep with validation. 3 retention ponds had been designed to handle storm drainage from 400 acres of former wetlands. Environmental bonds totaling $2. $8 million were posted to guarantee construction. The ponds were never built. Instead, after the first mansion sales, the developer filed emergency modification requests, claiming unexpected soil conditions required innovative drainage alternatives. The $2.8 million in environmental bonds vanished into a municipal slush fund that paid for everything except flood protection. "Here's where it gets personal," Diana said, sliding another document across my table. The final approval signature belonged to Harold Victor, Mrs. Victor's late husband. But Harold hadn't signed willingly. A paper trail of desperate correspondence showed him fighting the modifications for 8 months, filing increasingly frantic warnings about inevitable catastrophic flooding and criminal negligence in public safety. His final letter, written 3 days before forced early retirement, read like an engineer's suicide note. "I cannot approve this abomination. Willowbrook Estates will become an aquarium during any Category 3 storm or higher. This is not engineering opinion. This is physics." Harold had been silenced with early retirement and financial threats, but he'd hidden copies of everything in his home office for nearly 3 decades. Mrs. Victor had given Diana his complete files last week, along with something that made my heart race: current insurance documents. claim denial letters spanning 5 years, all from Willowbrook residents, all rejected for identical reasons. Flood damage attributable to pre-existing drainage deficiencies, not covered under standard homeowner policies. The insurance companies knew. They'd been systematically denying legitimate claims because they understood what Harold had tried to warn everyone about. Willowbrook was engineered for disaster, but the document that changed everything was a state environmental assessment commissioned 6 months ago. Climate change had transformed Florida's storm patterns. Century floods now happened every 2 decades. The study specifically identifies neighborhoods built on filled wetlands as extreme risk zones for total structural loss, Diana explained, her finger tracing projections that made my engineering background scream with recognition. Mrs. Victor's nephew had been building a federal case based on his uncle's documentation. The current HOA board had fiduciary duty to inform residents about known risks and implement protective measures. Instead, Constance had been systematically looting the reserve funds meant for exactly that purpose. Reserve account should hold $800,000 for emergency infrastructure, Diana said. Current balance? $47,000. The rest disappeared through her brother's management fees and her husband's political contractor friends. The beautiful, terrible irony crystallized. My flood wall wasn't an aesthetic violation. It was the only legitimate flood protection in 400 acres of vulnerable mansions. According to Harold's original specifications, every home should have had similar barriers. Constance hadn't been attacking my wall because it was ugly. She'd been attacking it because it exposed 8 years of criminal negligence and embezzlement. But Diana's final revelation made my pulse hammer against my ribs. Hurricane Delilah formed yesterday, she said quietly, sliding a NOAA bulletin across the table. Category 4 projection, direct hit in 72 hours. The timing was almost cosmic justice. Constance had spent 6 months trying to destroy the one structure designed to handle exactly what was spinning toward us across warm Atlantic waters. Thursday's emergency HOA meeting wasn't just about harassment anymore. It was about survival. Hurricane Delilah was 60 hours away, spinning toward us with winds that could turn marble fountains into projectiles. While neighbors debated whether to move their Teslas or just buy new ones after insurance payouts, I was converting Mrs. Victor's kitchen into mission control. The dining table disappeared under weather maps, engineering blueprints, and emergency supply lists. The smell of jasmine tea mixed with the sharp ozone scent of approaching weather. A combination that reminded me of planning levee repairs during my Army Corps days. "Show me where the water will go," Mrs. Victor said, her weathered finger tracing storm surge projections with the precision of someone who'd survived typhoons in Taiwan. I sketched water flow patterns on graph paper, red ink marking the path of destruction. Storm surge hits first. 8 to 12 feet of salt water pushing inland like a liquid bulldozer. Then, 6 to 10 inches of rainfall over 4 hours. The physics were brutal and simple. 400 acres of concrete and asphalt would funnel every drop toward the lowest elevation. My house sat in the exact spot where Harold Victor had warned floodwater would collect like soup in a bowl. Except now the bowl had a rim, my 3-foot concrete wall. Diana arrived with equipment that looked like a CNN field office. Cameras, satellite phones, and a laptop that could stream live video to news stations nationwide. Channel 7 wants exclusive storm coverage from Ground Zero, she announced. This story's going national. Perfect timing for Constance's public humiliation. But my real focus was emergency engineering, using the HOA's own infrastructure against them. Those decorative drainage ditches that cost triple the normal rate? Strategic sandbag placement could convert them into functional storm channels. The ornamental fountains throughout the development could become emergency water collection points if we removed the decorative pumps. We're turning their aesthetic masturbation into actual flood management, I explained to Mrs. Victor, who snorted with laughter while taking notes in handwriting precise enough for engineering specifications. Marcus Webb arrived with FEMA projections that made my calculations look optimistic. His briefcase smelled like disaster capitalism and government forms. 14 to 16 feet of storm surge, he said, spreading satellite imagery that showed our neighborhood as a blue-tinted lake. Your elevation puts you above the flood line. Everyone else. He shrugged like an accountant discussing inevitable bankruptcy. My modest ranch was about to become Noah's Ark for 200 families who'd spent months mocking my paranoid preparations. The garage transformation began immediately. Emergency water, 50 gallons in food-grade containers. Medical supplies. First aid kits designed for construction sites, not suburban boo-boos. Communications, battery-powered weather radio, and CB equipment for coordinating with emergency responders. Mrs. Victor organized our resistance network with the efficiency of someone who'd survived actual revolutions. Jennifer Martinez, the teacher from Lot 23, contributed emergency food that could feed 20 people for 3 days. Dave Kumar, our postal worker, showed up with a generator that could power essential equipment. Simple rule, I explained to our small group while demonstrating emergency radio protocols. Monitor Channel 9 for weather updates, Channel 16 for emergency coordination. If cellular towers go down, and they will, we're the neighborhood's communication hub. The technical knowledge felt good to share. How to calculate safe water levels using permanent markers on walls. How to identify structural damage versus cosmetic flooding. How to document everything for insurance claims that wouldn't be systematically denied. But my masterpiece was converting Constance's decorative water features into functional storm management. The Italian marble fountain outside the clubhouse could collect and filter 2,000 gallons if we disconnected the recirculation system. The ornamental pond near the tennis courts would become emergency water storage. Flood management isn't rocket science, I told our group while sketching modifications on napkins. You redirect, you collect, you distribute. Basic physics beats expensive landscaping every time. Thursday's emergency HOA meeting had evolved from Constance's harassment tribunal into my public vindication. Diana would film everything, while I presented 8 years of documented corruption, backed by hurricane-force evidence. I'd prepared presentation materials that would make corporate fraud investigators weep with joy. Harold Victor's original warnings, insurance company correspondence, financial records showing exactly how reserve funds had been looted. But my secret weapon was simpler. 3 decades of engineering credibility versus a pharmaceutical heiress who thought money could control weather patterns. The sweet anticipation of justice, mixed with the metallic taste of storm pressure dropping. Hurricane weather has a distinctive smell, like electricity and possibility, and the kind of change that washes everything clean. My wall wasn't just protecting one house anymore. It was about to become the foundation for rebuilding an entire community, based on competence instead of corruption. Tomorrow evening, Constance would discover that some forces can't be bribed, threatened, or legislated away. Mother Nature was about to audit her books personally. Hurricane Delilah intensified to Category 4 overnight, her eye wall tightening like a noose around our section of coastline. The National Weather Service issued something I'd never seen in 30 years of engineering, a catastrophic flooding warning with mandatory evacuation orders for coastal areas and strongly recommended evacuation for inland zones like Willowbrook. Constance's response was pure pharmaceutical heiress logic. Throw money at the problem until it disappeared. By Thursday morning, she'd hired Blackwater-style private security to patrol the neighborhood, ostensibly for storm protection, but really to intimidate anyone supporting my flood wall. 3 SUVs with tinted windows and emergency response services logos cruise past my house every hour like sharks circling wounded prey. The security team leader knocked on my door at dawn, clipboard in hand and attitude dialed to maximum corporate authority. Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Fairweather has authorized emergency demolition of unsafe structures before the storm hits. For community safety, I studied his credentials through the screen door. And you're qualified to determine structural safety. How exactly? Ma'am hired engineering consultants who identified your wall as a potential dam that could redirect floodwater toward other properties. The same consulting firm that had designed Willowbrook's drainage disaster, naturally. But Constance had made a critical tactical error. She was trying to demolish evidence while Diana's cameras were rolling, and Marcus Webb was documenting everything for federal investigators. When the demolition crew arrived at noon, 2 bulldozers and a concrete saw that sounded like industrial murder, they found themselves facing more resistance than expected. Mrs. Victor had organized a human chain of supporters around my wall. Jennifer Martinez stood with her 3 elementary school kids, holding signs reading, "Engineers know best," and "Trust science, not snobbery." Dave Kumar brought his entire postal worker union local, 20 guys who understood bureaucratic harassment and didn't appreciate wealthy people weaponizing government services. The sight was surreal. Designer-dressed security guards trying to intimidate retired teachers and postal workers, while Hurricane Delilah spun closer to shore, with winds approaching 150 miles per hour. Diana's cameras captured every moment as Constance arrived in her white Tesla, stepping out like a general surveying a battlefield she was destined to win. "This is private property and emergency safety protocol," she announced to Diana's cameras, her voice carrying across the neighborhood like expensive authority. "Mr. Blackwood's refusal to comply with demolition orders is endangering everyone's lives." "Which engineering study supports that conclusion?" Diana asked, microphone positioned perfectly for maximum impact. Constance's pause lasted just long enough to reveal she had no engineering study, just expensive lawyers and political connections. "Our consulting firm's preliminary assessment indicates structural hazards that require immediate remediation." "Can you name the firm?" Another telling pause. "That information is currently under legal review." Beautiful. Diana's cameras were documenting in real time how Constance's harassment campaign crumbled under basic journalistic scrutiny. But the pharmaceutical princess wasn't finished escalating. That afternoon, while community supporters maintained their protective circle around my wall, Constance played her final card. She called her husband at city council and triggered an emergency municipal safety inspection that gave code enforcement authority to condemn structures deemed hazardous during disaster conditions. 2 city inspectors arrived with clipboards, measuring equipment, and the uncomfortable expressions of public employees being used for private vendettas. "Mr. Blackwood, we need to evaluate structural integrity before hurricane conditions arrive," the senior inspector explained apologetically. "Orders from emergency management." I handed him my original engineering specifications, Army Corps contact information, and documentation showing the wall exceeded all municipal safety requirements. "This structure was designed to withstand Category 5 conditions," I explained. "It's probably the safest thing in the neighborhood." The inspection took 3 hours and confirmed what everyone except Constance already knew. My wall was professionally engineered, properly constructed, and completely safe. But Constance had one more surprise. As the inspectors prepared to leave without condemning my wall, a black sedan pulled up with federal plates. 2 men in suits approached with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested serious government business. "Mr. Blackwood, Agent Morrison, FBI. We understand you've been documenting financial irregularities related to this homeowner association." My heart jumped. Diana's investigation had reached federal attention. "We'd like to discuss your documentation regarding municipal contract fraud and embezzlement of environmental protection funds." Constance went pale as yogurt. Her private security team suddenly found reasons to check their phones. Even the demolition crew started loading equipment back onto trucks. The FBI's timing was exquisite. Hurricane Delilah was 24 hours from landfall, and federal agents wanted to discuss 8 years of corruption, while potential evidence sat in the path of catastrophic flooding. "We'll need access to HOA financial records before the storm hits," Agent Morrison continued, "along with any documentation you've gathered about systematic insurance fraud." Constance's pharmaceutical fortune couldn't buy her way out of federal investigation. Hurricane Delilah made landfall at 2 a.m. Friday morning, with winds that turned Spanish moss into horizontal whips and palm trees into oversized lawn darts. The eye wall passed directly over Willowbrook Estates, transforming our exclusive gated community into an exclusive underwater theme park. I watched from my elevated living room as nature conducted her audit of Constance's financial crimes, with 140 miles per hour winds and a storm surge that peaked at 11 feet above sea level. The pharmaceutical heiress had spent Thursday evening in full denial mode, hosting a storm party in her marble mansion, while emergency officials begged residents to evacuate. Her last social media post, time-stamped at 11:47 p.m., showed her toasting champagne with neighbors, riding out the storm in style. Hashtag Willowbrook Strong. Hashtag Weather the Storm. By 3 a.m., she was calling 911 from her second-floor balcony. My weather monitoring equipment provided real-time data to emergency responders, while my house served as the neighborhood's only functioning communication hub. The metallic taste of storm pressure, mixed with the electric satisfaction of watching physics prove every engineering calculation correct. Mrs. Victor's basement, dry as a bone thanks to water flowing around my wall, had become our emergency shelter for 23 people, including pregnant neighbor Lisa Santos and elderly residents who couldn't evacuate in time. "Your wall is directing everything toward the storm drains," Jennifer Martinez observed, watching brown floodwater flow past my foundation like a river avoiding rocks. "It's working exactly like you said it would." The time-lapse footage was spectacular. Water hit my concrete barrier and split into organized channels that fed directly into the municipal drainage system instead of pooling around foundations. My ugly wall was performing hydraulic engineering exactly as designed. But the real show was happening across the street. Constance's $2.8 million mansion sat in 6 feet of storm surge that had turned her circular driveway into a boat launch. Her 3 Teslas floated like expensive bathtub toys, bumping against marble columns with the gentle rhythm of very costly wind chimes. The Italian marble fountain, the one that cost more than most people's houses, was completely submerged, creating an underwater light display that would have been beautiful if it wasn't documenting financial ruin. "This is unbelievable," Diana broadcast live from my living room to Channel 7's storm coverage. "The only structure surviving Hurricane Delilah's record storm surge is the flood wall that HOA President Constance Fairweather spent 8 months trying to demolish." The pharmaceutical princess was learning expensive lessons about hydraulic engineering, while Coast Guard rescue boats navigated through what used to be her perfectly manicured neighborhood. At 4:30 a.m., my radio crackled with emergency coordination chatter. "Rescue 7 to base. We have visual on stranded residents at Willowbrook Mansion, requesting immediate water evacuation." I could see the Coast Guard boat approaching Constance's balcony, where she stood in designer pajamas that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, screaming about priority rescue and property damage liability. The Coast Guard's response was perfectly professional. "Ma'am, we evacuate based on medical necessity, not property values." Meanwhile, my house had become unofficial neighborhood headquarters for storm coordination. Emergency responders used my communications equipment. Insurance adjusters coordinated from my garage. Even federal agents monitoring the storm used my internet connection to track evidence preservation. Agent Morrison had spent Thursday evening securing HOA financial records before the storm could destroy them. "Convenient timing," he'd noted grimly. "Major hurricane hits just as we're investigating embezzlement. Some people might try to claim flood damage destroyed evidence." But Constance's biggest humiliation was still coming. At dawn, as storm surge began receding, the full scope of destruction became visible. Every mansion in Willowbrook had sustained major flood damage except mine. Cars floated in driveways. Swimming pools had become extension of the storm surge. Designer landscaping looked like abstract art created by liquid chaos. The pharmaceutical heiress who'd spent months claiming my wall would redirect floodwater toward neighbors was about to discover what actual flood redirection looked like. Her mansion's flood damage was concentrated on the side facing away from my wall, exactly where runoff would naturally flow without proper retention ponds to manage drainage. My wall had actually protected part of her property by directing water toward functioning storm drains. But the cruelest irony was insurance coverage. Marcus Webb coordinated with claims adjusters throughout the morning, documenting damage patterns that told a clear story. Homes with proper elevation and drainage protection, like mine, suffered minimal damage. Mansions built without flood mitigation in natural drainage areas were total losses. "Your flood insurance claim should be straightforward," Marcus told me while photographing my minor roof damage. "You'll get full coverage because you took reasonable protective measures." Meanwhile, Constance's insurance company had already issued preliminary denial notices to storm victims across Willowbrook, citing pre-existing drainage deficiencies and failure to implement reasonable flood protection. The pharmaceutical fortune that couldn't buy competent engineering was about to learn that it also couldn't buy retroactive flood insurance. The emergency community meeting happened Saturday afternoon in Willowbrook's half-flooded community center, 72 hours after Hurricane Delilah had turned our exclusive neighborhood into an expensive underwater museum. The smell of flood-damaged drywall mixed with the metallic stench of financial ruin and exposed corruption. 400 people packed the main hall, residents, media crews, insurance adjusters, federal agents, and emergency management officials. Water stains on the mahogany walls marked flood levels like rings on a very expensive tree. Constance arrived in borrowed clothes and a rented car, her pharmaceutical fortune temporarily reduced to whatever hadn't floated away during the storm surge. The woman who'd spent months orchestrating my harassment now faced a room full of neighbors whose mansions were ruined, partially because of her financial crimes. Mayor Richardson called the meeting to order, while Diana's cameras captured every moment for what was becoming national news coverage. We're here to address flood damage, emergency response coordination, and... The mayor paused, consulting notes that someone really didn't want him to read. Recent allegations of municipal contract fraud and environmental bond embezzlement. Agent Morrison stepped forward with documentation that made Constance's face go white as primer paint. Federal investigation has uncovered systematic embezzlement of HOA reserve funds and environmental protection bonds totaling $2. $8 million over 8 years, he announced to a room that went silent except for the distant hum of industrial dehumidifiers. These funds were specifically designated for flood mitigation measures that, if properly implemented, would have prevented approximately $31 million in storm damage across this community. The number hit the room like a physical blow. $31 million in damage that could have been prevented if Constance hadn't stolen money meant for flood protection. But my moment came when Mayor Richardson called me forward to explain why my house was the only property in Willowbrook that survived Hurricane Delilah intact. I walked to the podium carrying engineering blueprints, FEMA flood maps, and 3 decades of hydraulic engineering credibility. The room was so quiet you could hear flood water still dripping from damaged ceiling tiles. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, spreading Harold Victor's original flood mitigation plans across the presentation table. What happened during Hurricane Delilah wasn't a natural disaster. It was engineered negligence. I explained how Harold Victor's original design included retention ponds that would have managed stormwater safely, how those ponds were deleted from final construction to increase developable land, how the $2.8 million in environmental bonds meant to fund flood protection had been systematically stolen over 8 years. Mrs. Fairweather spent 8 months trying to demolish the only legitimate flood protection structure in this neighborhood, I continued, pointing to photographs of my wall directing water safely towards storm drains during the hurricane. She called it an eyesore that didn't belong in Willowbrook Estates. Turns out, proper engineering doesn't care about aesthetic opinions. That's when I delivered the line that would make national news and destroy Constance's reputation forever. Mrs. Fairweather claimed my wall would turn our neighborhood into a trailer park. Hurricane Delilah proved that her embezzlement already had. The room erupted. Neighbors who'd lost everything during the storm turned toward Constance with expressions that could melt concrete. Insurance adjusters took notes furiously. Federal agents smiled like prosecutors who'd just been handed a perfectly gift-wrapped case. Constance tried to respond, standing on shaking legs and speaking in a voice that had lost all its pharmaceutical authority. These allegations are... The engineering concerns were legitimate. My family has invested millions in this community. "Where?" shouted someone from the back. "Where's the investment? My house is ruined." "Your mansion's got a swimming pool in the living room," yelled another voice. "Where's our reserve fund?" Agent Morrison stepped forward before the meeting could turn into a lynch mob. "Mrs. Fairweather, you're under arrest for wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit embezzlement, and violations of federal environmental protection statutes." The handcuffs clicked with the finality of a bank vault closing on 8 years of corruption. As federal agents led her away, Constance made one final attempt at maintaining dignity. "This is persecution. I'll be vindicated." Mrs. Victor, speaking for the first time during the meeting, delivered the perfect response in a voice that carried her late husband's engineering integrity. "Mrs. Fairweather, water doesn't care about your vindication, and neither do we." The applause lasted 4 minutes. Diana's cameras captured every moment as federal agents escorted the pharmaceutical heiress through a crowd of neighbors whose lives she'd destroyed through greed and incompetence. The exclusive gated community that had spent months mocking my ugly flood wall was learning that survival beats aesthetics every time, and Mother Nature's audit was just getting started. 6 months after Hurricane Delilah, Willowbrook Estates had transformed from an exclusive enclave of pharmaceutical money into something resembling an actual community. The smell of fresh concrete and honest construction had replaced the stench of flood damage and financial corruption. Constance Fairweather was serving the first year of a 7-year federal sentence for wire fraud, mail fraud, and environmental crimes. Her marble mansion had been seized by federal marshals and converted into affordable housing for hurricane survivors. Poetic justice with a practical purpose. The $2.8 million in recovered embezzlement funds, combined with federal disaster relief money, had finally funded Harold Victor's original flood mitigation plan. 3 retention ponds now manage stormwater exactly as designed 3 decades ago, protecting 200 families from future flooding. My ugly wall had become the neighborhood's most photographed landmark, featured in engineering textbooks and FEMA best practices manuals. The concrete barrier that Constance had tried to demolish was now designated as historic flood protection infrastructure. But the real transformation was human. Mrs. Victor had been unanimously elected HOA president, replacing pharmaceutical authoritarianism with Taiwanese practicality and engineering wisdom. The new board consisted entirely of people who understood the difference between aesthetics and survival. Harold would be proud, she told me during our weekly coffee meetings, which had become neighborhood planning sessions for climate resilience. Finally, common sense defeats expensive stupidity. The Miriam Blackwood Memorial Flood Preparedness Scholarship provided $200,000 annually for local students studying engineering and environmental science. The first recipient was Mrs. Victor's granddaughter, who planned to study hydrology at the state university. "Your wife would love this," Mrs. Victor said during the scholarship ceremony, watching teenagers learn hydraulic engineering principles using models built from my wall specifications. Education defeating ignorance, one student at a time. Diana Reeves had won a Pulitzer nomination for her investigation of development corruption across 3 counties. Her documentary, The Flood Wall, became required viewing in journalism schools and municipal planning courses. Willowbrook was just the tip of the iceberg, she explained during a follow-up interview. Constance's case opened federal investigations into development fraud that's recovered $47 million in stolen environmental protection funds. The neighborhood's transformation included practical improvements that Harold Victor would have appreciated. Native plant gardens replaced water-hungry lawns, reducing runoff and providing wildlife habitat. Rain collection systems captured stormwater for irrigation. The community had earned certified wildlife habitat designation, attracting ecotourism that provided ongoing revenue. My engineering consulting practice, Community Resilience Solutions, was booming with requests from neighborhoods wanting to audit their own flood protection. 23 communities had implemented flood walls based on my Willowbrook design. "You've created a movement," Marcus Webb told me while documenting insurance savings from proper flood mitigation. "Communities that take engineering seriously are saving millions in storm damage." But the personal healing mattered most. I'd found love again with Jennifer Martinez, the teacher who'd stood with her children around my wall during Constance's demolition attempt. We married in Mrs. Victor's garden, surrounded by neighbors who'd become family through shared survival. "Miriam would approve," I whispered to Jennifer during our vows, feeling my late wife's presence in the engineering principles that had brought our community together. The annual Resilience Day celebration every September marked Hurricane Delilah's anniversary with community education, engineering displays, and Mrs. Victor's famous dumplings. Children learned flood science through hands-on experiments. Adults shared survival stories and planning strategies. Local emergency management officials attended for professional development, studying how community-scale engineering could prevent disaster instead of just responding to it. Willowbrook has become a model for climate adaptation, the county emergency coordinator explained during the latest Resilience Day. "You've proven that individual expertise plus community cooperation equals survival." The greatest victory was watching neighbors work together instead of competing over property values. Constance's toxic hierarchy had been replaced by mutual aid networks that shared resources, knowledge, and genuine concern for everyone's well-being. My flood wall still stands, protecting not just my property, but serving as a permanent reminder that competence beats corruption, engineering defeats entitlement, and communities survive through cooperation, not conflict.
You know, Ezra's story reminds me when I started this channel in the first place. 8 months. That's how long constant fair weather spent trying to tear down a 3-foot concrete wall. 8 months of $500 daily fines, emergency meetings, lawyers, all because she thought she could intimidate a retired engineer into submission. But here's the thing about people like Ezra. They don't get rattled. They don't make decisions based on anger or fear. They just do their homework. They study the flood maps. They read the original development contracts. They document everything. And when the Hurricane Delilah showed up with that storm surge, well, physics doesn't care how much money you have, does it? I keep coming back to that moment when the FBI walked into the HOA meeting. Can you imagine constant phrase? Own that power, own the connections, and suddenly none of it mattered because someone had actually been paying attention to where the money went. The thing is, we got stories like this more often than you might think. Different details, but same pattern. Someone stands up to an HOA board that gotten a little too comfortable with its authority. And sometimes the whole house of cards just collapses. Have you ever dealt with an HOA that thought they were untouchable? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if this story hit home for you, maybe share it with someone who is dealing with their own constant fair weather right now. Thanks for watching the HOA Lab. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see more stories like Ezra. Sometimes the quiet ones win.